I was not supposed to be in his study that evening. I had walked in looking for nothing. That was grief. You move through rooms without reason, occupying space because standing still feels like surrender. That was when I saw the screen. It had dimmed, but not completely. A white notification box sat in the center of the display. His name was at the top. Not mine, his. I read the message once, then read it again. Account update confirmed. Estate funds successfully transferred. Fairfax had been dead for 9 days. 9 days since the phone call. 9 days since I stopped being a mother in the present tense. The funeral flowers were still in the living room. I had walked past them to get here. Their scent still alive, even when he was not. And his money had already been moved. I did not touch the keyboard. I did not call out for Garrison. I stood exactly where I was and looked at the screen until I understood what I was looking at. The balance on Fairfax's estate account had been reduced to 0. The destination account bore one name, Garrison Fairchild, and his name appeared there alone, without mine beside it. The desk lamp cast light over his reading glasses, folded neatly beside the keyboard. His pen lay parallel to the desk edge, exactly where he always left it. Everything in that room was exactly as he had arranged it. Careful, deliberate, undisturbed. The screen dimmed completely, and my reflection appeared where the message had been. A woman standing in a quiet room. A wife who had just understood something she could not understand. Nothing in the room had moved, but something in my marriage had. Before Fairfax, there were 3 pregnancies that did not survive. I do not say that for sympathy. I say it because it is the foundation of everything that came after. Each loss was its own quiet devastation. The kind that settles into the corners of a life and stays there. Garrison was beside me through all of it. He drove me to appointments without being asked. He sat in waiting rooms with the same stillness he brought to everything, steady in a way that asked nothing from me in return. After the 3rd miscarriage, the doctor spoke carefully about risks and realistic expectations. Garrison listened, then took my hand on the way to the car and told me that 1 child, if we were fortunate enough, would be enough. That we were already enough. I believed him because he meant it. When Fairfax finally arrived, the birth nearly killed me. There were complications I will not detail here because the specifics matter less than what I remember, which is Garrison's face when it was over. Not relief exactly, something quieter than that. The expression of a man who had been holding his breath for years and had finally been allowed to exhale. We did not try for another child after that. Garrison made sure of it. He said our family was complete, and he said it without hesitation or grief, as though he had already made peace with every version of the future, except the one where something happened to me. Fairfax grew up knowing he was wanted. He grew up as the proof that we had survived something together and built something worth surviving for. By his mid-20s, he had founded a cybersecurity company out of a rented office in Palo Alto with 2 colleagues and a problem he believed he could solve. He was not chasing wealth. He was chasing a solution, and the wealth followed because the solution was exactly what the market needed. He called us the evening he signed the sale agreement and did not lead with the number. He led with the fact that the technology would continue without him, that he had made sure of it in the terms. That was the first thing he told us. The sale closed at $4.8 million. We did not celebrate loudly. We were not loud people. But that night Garrison held my hand across the kitchen table, the way he had not done in years, and neither of us let go. For a long time. There was nothing adequate to say. We had raised a child from a difficult beginning and watched him become a man who thought first about the work and second about the reward. That was not something we had taught him directly. It was something he had simply become. He was 28 years old. He was on his way home from the office on a Tuesday night when the accident happened. The details are not the point. The point is that he left for work that morning and did not come back, and every version of the future that had included him was quietly canceled without warning or negotiation. He was 28 years old. In the days after the funeral, I watched my husband disappear without leaving the house. But if I am being honest, I was barely present myself. Losing Fairfax was not like any pain I had encountered before. It was not grief the way I had understood grief. It was an amputation. A removal of something so fundamental that the body does not immediately register the absence. It simply keeps reaching for what is no longer there. I reached for him constantly. In the mornings when the house was quiet, I would think for 1/2 second that I heard him. And then I would remember. And the remembering was its own fresh wound every single time. There was no getting used to it. Only the same loss arriving again and again, at unexpected hours, without mercy. He had been our miracle, our only child. Gone at 28 years old, before I had finished being proud of him. I moved through the house anyway. I made dinner, I cleared plates, I accepted condolences from people whose words dissolved before they reached me. I functioned because functioning was the only alternative to collapse, and I could not collapse because I believed that Garrison and I would eventually find each other inside this darkness and hold on. That was what I was waiting for. That was what never came. He stopped saying Fairfax's name. I would mention a memory and Garrison would go very still and say nothing. Not uncomfortable silence, deliberate silence. The kind that communicates without words that a subject is closed. One evening, his dinner sat untouched at the table for an hour. He had walked past it without a word and closed himself in his study. I told myself he was broken by grief. But something about his silence had a quality I could not name yet. It did not feel like sorrow, it felt like concentration. I discovered it on a Thursday morning, the way you discover most things that change everything. Quietly, without announcement, while doing something ordinary. I was paying a household bill online, a routine I had performed dozens of times without thinking. I entered my credentials, and the screen returned an access error. I tried again. The same result. I checked the account number, confirmed my password, and attempted a third time. The account was no longer accessible to me. I sat with that for a moment before I went looking for Garrison. I found him in the kitchen, standing at the counter with his coffee, looking out the back window the way he had taken to doing, present in body, absent in every other sense. I told him calmly that I could not access the joint account, and asked if he knew why. He did not turn from the window immediately. When he did, his expression did not change. He said he would look into it. Then he turned back to the window. He never looked into it. He never mentioned it again, and I made a decision in that moment that I did not fully understand at the time. I decided not to ask a second time. Not because I was afraid of his answer. Because I had begun to suspect that his answer would be a performance rather than an explanation. And I was no longer interested in performances. I was interested in the truth. So I stopped asking questions he could control. I began looking for answers he did not know I was searching for. The difference between those two approaches was the difference between being managed and being informed. I chose to be informed. Weeks had passed since the joint account went silent, but the paper trail Garrison left behind spoke louder than anything he had said. I did not hire anyone. I did not announce my intentions. I simply requested the estate filings directly from the Superior Court of California, County of Santa Clara, Probate Division, in downtown San Jose. It was a public record request, entirely within my rights, entirely unremarkable to anyone processing it. I sat in a small waiting area while a clerk retrieved the documents. The room was quiet and institutional. Pale walls, fluorescent light, the sound of papers being moved in an office I could not see. Nothing about it felt significant from the outside. That was the strange thing about discovering the truth. It rarely arrives with appropriate ceremony. The clerk set a folder on the counter, and I carried it to a table near the window. I read through it slowly. The first document showed that Garrison had filed to become temporary administrator of Fairfax's estate within days of his death. He had not mentioned it to me. He had not asked. He had simply filed. The second document showed a transfer of estate funds into a private account registered solely in his name. The account I did not know existed. The third document was a formal declaration in which Garrison had stated that Fairfax intended him alone to oversee and control the estate. There was no supporting evidence attached, only his assertion. The fourth document showed that he had legally declared himself sole beneficiary and executor. I turned the pages without rushing. I read each line with the same attention I had given to everything since the joint account went dark. Carefully, completely, without allowing my conclusions to move ahead of the evidence. But the evidence was unambiguous. Some of these documents carried preparation dates that preceded the funeral. I closed the folder and sat for a moment in the institutional quiet of that room. This was not a man undone by grief, reaching for something to hold. This was a man who had made a plan. I have spent a great deal of time trying to understand what happened to my husband after Fairfax died, not to excuse it. Understanding and excusing are not the same thing, and I want to be precise about that distinction. Garrison had built his entire sense of purpose around being a father. Not in a performative way. In the way that quiet, steady men sometimes do, where the role becomes so deeply embedded in their identity that they do not notice how completely it has replaced everything else. Fairfax was his legacy, his proof that his life had extended beyond himself, his answer to the question of whether any of it had mattered. When Fairfax died, Garrison lost the answer to that question. I watched him try to locate himself in the weeks that followed and find nothing. He had retired 2 years earlier. His friendships were surface level in the way that many men his age allow them to become. His days had been structured around Fairfax's life, following his company, his progress, his future. Without that structure, Garrison was a man standing in an empty room, with no memory of what the furniture had looked like. I think he looked at his retired friends and saw comfort and security and forward motion, and then looked at himself and saw only absence. I think the fear of irrelevance arrived quietly and settled permanently. And then there was the inheritance. $4.8 million that Fairfax had built with his own hands. The last tangible evidence that their relationship had produced something real. I think Garrison decided that if he could hold on to that, he could hold on to something. That is not a justification. It is a diagnosis. He chose to take what was not his to take. He chose it deliberately and in advance. Whatever grief drove him to that decision, the decision itself was his alone. I made the appointment myself. I did not tell Garrison. Faith's office was on the 3rd floor of a building in Palo Alto, modest and precise in the way that serious professionals often are. Books arranged by subject, a desk cleared of everything unnecessary, 2 chairs positioned across from each other, without a power imbalance built into the furniture. I appreciated that immediately. She had represented Fairfax's estate interests before his death. She knew the filings. She knew the timeline, and she had agreed to see me without requiring an explanation beyond my name and my relationship to the deceased. I sat across from her and told her what I had found in the probate records. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Mrs. Fairchild, Nothing your husband filed removes your legal standing. You were never excluded. The law still recognizes your claim fully. I did not cry. I did not exhale with visible relief. I simply received the information and let it settle. She walked me through what Garrison had done, the administrator filing, the transfers, the declarations. She explained each document clearly and without drama. She confirmed that he had acted without my knowledge and without legal authority to exclude me. Then she outlined what I could do next. I listened carefully. I asked 2 questions. I thanked her for her time. On the way back to my car, I noticed that something had shifted in the way I was moving through the world. The confusion that had followed me since the joint account went dark had quietly vacated. The exposure I had felt standing in that probate office had dissolved. Garrison had controlled access. He had never controlled the truth. I no longer needed him to explain himself. I no longer needed anything from him at all. I was not angry. I was not relieved. I was ready. I set 2 cups of tea on the table that evening. An old habit. The kind that survives grief and anger and the slow dissolution of a marriage, simply because the hands remember what the heart has stopped believing in. Garrison sat across from me. He had come when I asked him to, which surprised me slightly. He settled into his chair with the careful movements of a man who understood that something was different about this particular evening, but had not yet decided how to respond to it. I did not begin with an accusation. I did not present documents or reference attorneys or mention the hearing scheduled for the following morning. I simply sat across from the man I had been married to for 33 years and gave him the space to speak. The tea cooled between us. He looked at the table more than he looked at me. When his eyes did meet mine, they moved away quickly, not with guilt exactly, but with the practiced avoidance of a man who has decided that eye contact is a form of admission he is not prepared to make. I watched his hands. They were still. The same hands that had held mine in a hospital corridor while a doctor told us our son was gone. The same hands that had steadied me through 3 losses before Fairfax arrived. They rested on the table now as though they belonged to someone I had never met. The silence between us was not empty. It was the fullest silence I had ever sat inside. It held 33 years of a shared life, 3 pregnancies that did not survive, 1 son who had, and every conversation we would never now have the occasion to finish. I gave him a long time. He did not speak. At some point I understood that he was not going to. Not because he lacked the words. Because he had made his choice long before he sat down at this table, and speaking now would only be the performance of a remorse he did not feel. I reached for my wedding ring. I did not pull it off quickly. I eased it from my finger, the way you handle something that was once precious, and must be set down with care, even when you are setting it down for the last time. I placed it on the table between us. He looked at it. He did not reach for it. I stood and left the room without another word. There was nothing left to say that the ring had not already said for me. The Superior Court of California, County of Santa Clara. Probate Division occupied a floor of the courthouse in downtown San Jose that felt designed to remove emotion from proceedings. Pale walls, ordered rows, a bench elevated just enough to establish authority without theatrics. I found it appropriate. What was happening here did not require drama. The facts had always been sufficient on their own. Faith sat beside me. Garrison sat across the aisle with his attorney. I did not look at him when I entered. I found my seat, arranged my documents, and waited. The hearing proceeded with the quiet efficiency of a process that had been designed over centuries to resist manipulation. Faith presented the evidence clearly and without embellishment. The administrator filing, the unauthorized transfers, the declarations Garrison had made without my knowledge or consent. the preparation dates that preceded our son's funeral. The judge listened, asked 2 clarifying questions, reviewed the documentation. Garrison's attorney spoke briefly. Garrison himself said nothing. I watched him from across the room. He sat with the same stillness he had brought to our dining table the night before. The same set of his shoulders, the same careful arrangement of his hands, the same silence that had answered every question I had ever needed him to answer. He did not defend himself. He did not interrupt. He did not look at me. His silence in that courtroom was not a new silence. It was the same silence, arriving at its natural conclusion. The judge revoked his authority as a state administrator. Garrison was ordered to return the funds in full. Facing the legal consequences of his own documentation, he relinquished his claim without resistance. Full authority over Fairfax's estate transferred to me. I did not feel triumph. I felt recognition. This outcome had not been created here in this courtroom. It had been created the night he chose not to speak. I left on a Wednesday morning with 1 bag. I had packed it the night before without ceremony. The things that were mine, in the most essential sense, the documents, the photographs of Fairfax that belonged to me, the small items that carried private meaning. I left everything else exactly where it was. The house and its contents had their own history, and I was not interested in dismantling it. I was only interested in leaving it behind. I moved through the rooms one final time without sentiment. Not because I felt nothing, but because feeling everything and moving anyway was the only kind of strength I had left, and I intended to use it correctly. At the front door, I stopped. On the wall to my left hung the photograph from the day we brought Fairfax home from the hospital. I had passed it 10,000 times without stopping. That morning, I stopped. Garrison was young in that photograph. Looked younger than our son had lived to be. He was holding Fairfax with the careful terror of a man who understood that he was responsible for something fragile and extraordinary. His eyes were full of a love so unguarded, it was almost painful to look at directly. I looked at it for a long time. That man had existed. He had been real. He had held my hand through the worst years of my life and meant every moment of it. He was also gone. As gone as Fairfax. Lost to something I had not been able to prevent or retrieve. I did not touch the photograph. I left it where it had always been, on the wall of a house I was no longer part of. I closed the door quietly behind me. Not because I was uncertain. Because it was finished. I returned to the house once, several weeks later, to collect the remaining documents I needed to finalize Fairfax's estate transfer. I had arranged it in advance. Garrison knew I was coming. He was there when I arrived and gone before I finished, which told me everything I needed to know about the state of the life he was living inside those walls. The house was exactly as I had left it. That was the thing I noticed most. Not disorder. Not change. Exactly as I had left it. The same arrangement of furniture, the same objects in the same positions, the photograph of the 3 of us still on the wall by the entrance, the same stillness that had been accumulating since Fairfax died, undisturbed and unaddressed. Nothing had moved forward. I walked through the rooms briefly and did not linger. I collected what I needed and prepared to leave. Before I reached the door, I looked toward the dining table. My wedding ring was exactly where I had placed it the night before the hearing. Exactly where I had left it when I stood and walked out of the room. It had not been moved. It had not been touched. It sat in the same position on the same surface, as though time in that house had simply stopped at the moment I removed it. I looked at it for a moment. Then I left it where it was, the same way I had left the photograph, the same way I had left everything that belonged to a life I was no longer living. Garrison had wanted to hold on to something after Fairfax died. He had wanted to possess something that could not leave him. In the end, everything left him, including the person who would have stayed.